so I'm using it for functionality purposes. The other thing that is in the network DRM, because they don't employ social systems, is what I call next-gen DRM. And this is basically publisher-oriented. Ubisoft and EA have been dropping them on their games, and they are really strict and stringent. Then we also have the social DRMs, which are broadly categorized into two categories. You've got the content delivery, which is Steam, where you have a focus on digital delivery of content, so you don't have to worry about putting on pants to purchase your games. You can you'll just purchase everything online, you'll give them your credit card or somebody else's credit card, and everything is cool. At least until they discover that you gave them somebody else's credit card. And this is where I see most of the game platforms starting to move into, because they are trying to use the social component to convince you to really buy a game. What is a side note here is what I've put in like gray here is the walled garden model. And people don't usually think about this, but these are all the consoles that are out there, and that's why they are less interesting to some extent to talk about. And most of the stuff that I've covered so far is all about PC-based gaming. The walled garden is basically you've got specific hardware, you've got specific software, and you've got a gatekeeper that prevents software from arbitrarily coming into the garden or users from arbitrarily coming into the garden. And the iPhone and other mobile platforms are basically similar to this. Now, let's hop into the privacy aspects of this, because that's one of the main topics here. So, again, I'll repeat myself here. For the copy protection, we basically have the main intent of copy protection is to locally prevent you from duplicating something. So you keep a local state that is not exposed to the world. Although, one thing that might already be of a little bit of privacy concern, or of concern in general, is that they modify your operating system. They install drivers that later on could wreak havoc and cause a couple of crashes, or just bring your system to a crawl, and it also stores data locally. So somebody later on could still figure out that you have used a specific copy protection scheme. And sometimes they stomp on each other too, which is kind of funny. Now, the biggest failure of copy protection, and that's why they are basically outdated, is that the advances in the current technology have made them to some extent obsolete, and it's all of this arm race. And the biggest points here is the digital reproduction, and I'm thinking specifically about the feelies that I talked about earlier, anything that uses a lookup table that is printed and you get with the game. But also binary analysis technology, hardware in terms of like we can just rip any disk at this point, and then the internet that gives us this great big community where we can chat about problems that we have, how to break a DRM, and also how to share data. But the very fundamental problem that is really the underlying, basically I would say Achilles heel of this whole system, is that you have everything on copy protection relies on an error case functionality. So you have this one check that will say, do you have the proper disk? Do you have the proper registration key? And then there is a yes/no branch. And that's pretty much it. And you can toss as many as you want in there. But if you find them all, you can just continue playing. Now, the network DRM, as I said, is a step up from this. And actually, I want to formally define DRM, if I can actually read this on my screen here through the glare. It's technology, and this is courtesy of Wikipedia, it's technology that inhibits uses for digital content not desired or intended by the content provider. And if you think about this a bit, it's significantly more than just copy protection. This basically means if you start this, I mean, in a really broader sense, this could mean if you start this up at 12 p.m. at night, or at 12 a.m. at night, and it's not intended to be played between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., then DRM will take care of that. That's way more than copy protection. And so this restricts the usage. And therefore it needs to monitor you more closely, and it needs an external monitor, because a local monitor you could just change. In terms of privacy, this has significant impact. Because first of all, we either have a unique machine identifier, or we even have what's worse, a user ID, where we fingerprint the user or we fingerprint the machine. And fingerprinting the machine means that you basically query and look through all of the hardware that's there, and you could theoretically already publish that to somebody. then all of this naturally needs to be exposed in some extent over the network. And this exposure might be just a data stream because it's encrypted and they're actually doing their due diligence. But it could also be more that you have a user account and so on. I'll get into this in more detail. But basically, I can identify at this point if I'm installing a game, if I'm starting a game, and if it's a runtime check, if the game is actually running. And one of the big things here that is on the horizon and hasn't quite happened yet is the content execution thing. And this is what Ubisoft in particular has been talking about. And I've actually tried to leave names out of this, but it's in some extent not possible. The idea here is that you don't have the full program on disk. You have most of the program, and at specific points it pulls down critical pieces of executable content. And this, when you think about it, has first of all the privacy aspect that now, since these are bigger pieces of content, I can probably identify more directly what you're doing. But in the other aspect, it's also you get executable code through just other means. If somebody hijacks this, all bad things can happen. But this is more, it's on the horizon, and it's something that might be of concern in like a year or so. Now, network DRM has had a couple of spectacular failures, and I'll go through a couple of those because they're quite amusing, and it also shows that they just don't learn. The first one that I want to bring up, it has been extensively in the media, so I'll gloss over it, is Spore. It uses the SecuROM DRM, and the main idea here is that it requires an online registration on install, and it has an install limit, which should already ring all your bells. If your computer or your hard drive crashes a couple of times, you can't install this past 3, or you couldn't originally. And it also, quote, phones home, meaning that it contacts the server from time to make sure everything is still valid. This was in 2008, and in September, it basically was the most pirated game ever before it ever came out. There were about 500,000 torrent downloads before the release date, and this was a major failure in terms of like DRM. It was just stripped off the disk immediately. A lot of the people that actually used it really didn't like it, and that's that little picture there that is the content in the game. For the people that don't know Spore, the idea is that you have like a little amoeba and you develop it into this galactic civilization, and along that you can create a lot of custom content. And the game just got 1-star ratings, although for all other intensive purposes, it's a cool game. From a DRM perspective, the binaries also stayed on disk, so you were pretty much, you got those binaries for good. Luckily, with all of the buzz around this, in December, there was actually a release of an uninstall tool, and the uninstall tool, if you did it correctly, would remove most of the binaries, and it would also reset your install count. But the question is, why not immediately get it right? And this is one of the first examples of the network DRM starting to completely fail and fall apart. The next game, Stalker Clear Sky. It's a more obscure game in this sense because it's a first-person shooter that's around Chernobyl with sci-fi aspects. I encourage you to check it out because it's actually quite a lot of fun to play. But it uses this obscure Target DRM. I shouldn't say obscure, it's pretty popular. But it basically has the same idea behind it. You have an online registration, you've got an installation limit, and by the way, this time they already learned the lesson. You can uninstall and that you get the installation back, or you can at least go to a site if you know what you're doing and say, yes, I uninstalled this. But in December of 2009, after this game was released, Steam had a sale. And here we see already Steam itself provides a DRM. But the DRM from Target was still on top of Stalker, and so once you installed it through Steam, it would go ahead and contact the DRM server from this DRM system. And as it happened over Christmas, because of so many people using it, the DRM servers went down. And I don't want to blame the French for not being in the offices during Christmas, but it took a few days for them to bring them up online, and it was intermittent failures. So imagine you bought this, and for 3 days you can't play because it tells you you haven't purchased this legally or I can't verify this. And this is the next step that points towards that this is just not feasible anymore. Now the next one has been in the media quite extensively, and that's Assassin's Creed 2. And this is actually kind of different problem here, because before we had this activation limit, and the problem was basically the activation. And this was a single point in time where it was checked, and then ideally we were good for a while. The Ubisoft DRM, on the other hand, and it, by the way, has a real name, but nobody really cares for it, It's just used by all Ubisoft games. And it requires a permanent connection, and I want you to fully understand this. Permanent means that if you play single player and you never intend to go online, you never intend to play this with anybody, or it's a full single player game, you still need to have a perfectly fine internet connection. And if you don't, and it drops, then you would be reset originally to a checkpoint, which you can always see. If I can mess with the network, then I can pretty much make somebody scream in front of their computer, and we'll get into that in a bit. But this whole system was tied to a user account. And it also stores safe games in the cloud, and that was actually the big selling point from marketing. I guess they couldn't come up with any other reason why people should really buy into this, except for your safe games are stored in the cloud, and if your computer catches on fire, your private files and your bank account is lost, but at least you've got your safe games, because we have it in the cloud. So in March of this year, the obvious thing happened. Authentication servers went down. And depending on who you listen to, it was a DDoS, they just didn't know what they are doing, probably it was all of the above. The fundamental fact is that the servers were down for plus 10 hours multiple times, and this means a block of 10 hours where you just cannot play, and multiple blocks. And you have purchased this game for 60, 70 bucks, so this is not good. And this impacts single player users. And the official statement from Ubisoft was 95% of the users were not affected. These are not the droids you're looking for. But it's just the fact that even the cloud saves at this point failed. So what was the answer? Patch it, obviously. Luckily, it was patched relatively quickly. Some of the connection problems went away, and the good thing is that they at least reacted. Now the game pauses when you lose connection, and then it resumes at the same point that you dropped off. You're not reset to a checkpoint that was 5 hours ago. And you can also do local saves. So we see a bit of positive development, but there's still, the question is, why should we use this? And there's also data that streams over the network that I'll get into in a bit. The next thing is, I apologize if there should be anybody from Ubisoft in the room, but I mean, this is just what happened. There's Settlers 7. It might be a bit more obscure in the US market, but in the German market, this was a big game. And the idea here is that you have like little settlers that run around, and you have like, you mine stuff, you build buildings, and so on. It again uses the same DRM like Assassin's Creed, and so on, same selling points. And in April of this year, it came out in Germany, and there were immediate authentication server failures. This was so bad that they had, within a couple of hours, 50K posts in the forum. And this wasn't like random people screaming like, your game sucks. This was like, literally, I can't play this. I want my money back. And the multiplayer component for it was virtually unplayable. And it's kind of unclear if this was an interaction with the DRM, if this was the game being totally like just full of bugs, but the main essence here is that the DRM didn't make it better. It was patched with little effect, and then the actually really hilarious part was that in June it came out in Australia, and the Australian players were immediately greeted with, this game isn't active in your region yet. So, I mean, this happened for a short period until they got their act right, but it is kind of a problem that you see with DRM too. If nobody flips the bit, then you're screwed. Now, I'm pointing out the obvious thing here. The network DRM is just a futile attempt, and the internet summarized it very well with this picture that I don't even have to further explain. The only measurement or metric I want to give you here is that Assassin's Creed 2 has been cracked, and Assassin's Creed 2 had the uncrackable DRM, end quote, was cracked in 25 hours. So this is not a major hurdle for anybody. Now, from a publisher's and game developer's perspective, what's the next step? I mean, this is clearly broken. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The privacy impacts of this. That is definitely interesting to get into. So the Ubisoft DRM is the most stringent of this, of these sets of DRMs. And when you look at the network traffic that is going on in your system, when you actually run one of those Ubisoft games, it has a TCP connection that's encrypted over port 80 or any other port that is tunneled, because it could depend on what your network looked like. It actually does a fair attempt of trying to get out, obviously. It's also required for single player, and it has the whole failures. But what this actually means is that you have the ability to track all game usage at this point. You have this